everyone, and welcome back to COVID and the Classroom, a podcast dedicated to getting kids back to school, putting parents in positions of power, and navigating the new world of education in the time of coronavirus. I'm your host, Mary Clare Amslam. So I started last week's episode with saying that I'm tired. I think it's safe to say I'm significantly more tired this week. First of all, let me say congratulations to you if you are listening to this, because that means that you have turned off the news. That's something that I can't say that I've done the past couple days. I'm recording this on Friday. You all will be listening to this on Monday. So future you out there knows more than I do right now. But I think it's safe to say that everything's a mess. There's going to be a lot of legalities surrounding this election. It's going to be contested for quite a long time. So hang in there, everybody. But we do have a bit of a bright spot, and it connects to what we talked about on last week's episode, which is identity politics. And I think it's pretty clear that the loser in Tuesday's election was identity politics. Mike Gonzalez, who I spoke to in the last episode, wrote for the Wall Street Journal that it wasn't clear by Wednesday afternoon who had won the White House, but one bad idea was soundly defeated on Tuesday: identity politics. The concept that the country should be divided into aggregated categories by race, national origin, or sex, now a core tenet of the Democratic Party, lost from coast to coast. I think he's exactly right. President Trump improved with every demographic area except for white men. And so, obviously, politics is one thing. Identity politics is sort of a separate category, but it's good for our country that we see more people breaking out of these groups that we've been trying to place them into and start thinking for themselves and start rebelling against this identity politics class that we're putting in people into. I think that that's a great thing for our country. So that's the bright spot that I at least am focusing in on this Friday afternoon. So let's get into today's headlines. The first story is from the 74. Using tutors to combat COVID learning loss, new research shows that even lightly trained volunteers drive academic gains. I find this so interesting because a lot of the conversation around education policy revolves around how do we properly train teachers to effectively teach students. And a lot of times the answer for that is, well, we need to send them to grad school. We need to do further training. We need to focus on this credential. But this study is showing that light training is equipping instructors to teach students in a way that leads to academic gains, and that's a great, great thing. So according to the 74, what if the benefits of individual or small group instruction could be offered to the kids who need it most? It's a question that policy experts have asked for years, often in response to research showing incredible learning growth associated with small-scale tutoring initiatives. While individual programs often demonstrate impressive results, however, the cost of bringing them to scale has tended to derail the conversation. The study finds that while teachers and paraprofessionals were shown to be the strongest instructors, the authors write, even lightly trained volunteers or family members have the potential to help children realize important academic gains. Philip Oreopoulos, a public policy professor at the University of Toronto and one of the paper's authors, told the 74 that he felt excited by the consistency of the results. It really does seem to be the case that under different circumstances, different environments, different states, most studies point to the direction of saying that this is a really good activity to boost student performance. So once again, I think this shows that parental involvement in education makes a world of difference for that student. And we don't necessarily need to be over-credentialing individuals in teaching in order for those academic gains to be realized. It's another great victory for homeschooling. It's another great victory for private tutoring. Next story. This is a fun story. I'm not going to pretend to know very much about sports, but according to the Associated Press, Seahawks quarterback Russell Wilson and Sierra, who's apparently his wife, I didn't know that, fund charter schools in the Seattle area. So this is just a fun example of celebrities getting involved in education choice. So according to the Associated Press, while he's leading the NFL in touchdown passes and directing the highest scoring offense in the league, Seattle Seahawks quarterback Russell Wilson is staying busy with philanthropic efforts away from the field. This week, Wilson and his wife, Sierra, announced they are contributing $1.75 million to a charter school in the Seattle area through their Why Not You Foundation. Wilson and Sierra are contributing about $1.75 million to rebrand an existing charter program known as Cascade Midway Academy just south of Seattle. The Cascade High School program was set to debut this year before the pandemic forced founders Garth Reeves and Scott Canfield to delay the opening. Canfield said the superstar couple's generosity will be honored with the school's name changed to Why Not You Academy, but that Wilson and Sierra won't be involved in the school's day-to-day operations. We hear so much from celebrities nowadays. They tell us every opinion that they have. Sometimes we really don't want to hear it, but I just wanted to share some goodwill that's being put out there, some great money that's being donated to help the charter school effort. Charter schools have helped kids so much all throughout the country. I've talked ad nauseum on this podcast about how parents need more options, and charter schools are a great, great way to provide families with options in states that don't have robust school choice programs. Most states do have charter school laws, and so any help that we can give to that charter school sector is a really great thing. Next up, and I'll just mention this briefly because I don't want to go through every single delayed school opening because there are so many of them, but according to WTOP, in a reversal, DC public schools will not reopen elementary school classrooms for most students next week as planned, citing the need to readjust staffing plans after strong pushback from teachers. DC Public School Chancellor Louis Farabee announced the move on Monday. We have heard feedback from many in our community about the school system's reopening plans, and we will use this moment to adjust our timeline and staffing plans for reopening, he wrote on Twitter. The plan announced last month allowed for up to 75% of elementary school students eventually to return to the classroom starting November 9th. Instead, all students will begin a second term with virtual learning. Okay, so you guys know how I feel about this. Virtual learning is a disaster for parents who don't have another option. These constant delayed reopenings are yanking parents around who are making plans around their kids going back to school, only for it to turn out that they're delaying it once again. We need clear messaging from our public schools, and we need to stick to the plans that we're giving parents, especially in places like DC where parents don't have a lot of other options. And our final story of the day is looking at a bit of research. And once again, from a guest that we previously have had on this podcast, my colleague Jonathan Butcher, wrote a report for the State Policy Network, Are Learning Pods in Trouble? A new State Policy Network report by Jonathan Butcher details state regulations threatening the parent-driven solution. So we're all a big fan of pandemic pods, especially on this podcast here at the Heritage Foundation, because we think it's a great example of parents taking charge of their child's education during these times that are leaving parents without many options. But strong way that we can ruin all of that great work that we're doing in American civil society is to slap a bunch of burdensome regulations on there. So Jonathan wrote, around the country, state agencies and even district and city officials have issued statements tightening the restrictions around the formation of learning pods, or at least threatening to. Writing for the State Policy Network this week, Jonathan Butcher completed a review of state and local guidelines for learning pods. The overlap between learning pods and in-home daycare requirements as opposed to homeschool is significant because daycare rules are more stringent and numerous than homeschooling rules, Jonathan explains. Regulations like this could interfere with parents' efforts to create pods in the future, and with districts such as Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, and other closed to in-person learning for the foreseeable future, pods will remain a solution for parents dissatisfied with virtual education content from school districts. Again, learning pods are a fantastic option. It's really just heartwarming to see American civil society raise up at this moment and say, we're going to get together in our communities, we're going to educate our kids. I mean, that's how people did it in the early days of this country. And I just think it's absolutely fantastic. And for the government to come along and put those burdensome regulations on top of saying, we're not going to open your district assigned school on time, a lot of parents are just throwing their hands up in the air and saying, well, what do you want from us? What do you expect us to do? Our kids are struggling with this Zoom learning. It's not helping them. We're trying to do better by them. And then you're slapping these regulations on us. I mean, what gives? So we definitely should be keeping an eye on these regulations put on pandemic pods. I encourage everyone to head over to State Policy Network and read this report from Jonathan Butcher. It really is a great way to keep an eye on what the government is doing to crack down on pandemic pods. And some important context for this conversation around pandemic pods is that a Pew survey found last week that 72% of parents in low-income households were fearful that their children were falling behind because of the conditions the pandemic created. Learning pods are a viable solution for students from all backgrounds, and policymakers should be careful that regulators do not stifle this alternative. So once again, these regulations are specifically hurting the most vulnerable among us, those in our low-income communities. And so the very people that that a lot of these government bureaucrats are claiming to help are being the most hurt by cracking down on pandemic pause, which is simply parents exercising their right to educate their children as they see fit. I'm so pleased to be joined today by an expert on all things school choice and state policy. Jason Bedrick is the Director of Policy for EdChoice. In that role, he works closely with local organizations and state policymakers to develop high-quality educational choice policies that will benefit as many students as possible, including reviewing and providing feedback on legislation, leading policy briefings, providing expert testimony, writing op-eds, and conducting original research. Previously, Jason served as policy analyst with the Cato Institute's Center for Educational Freedom, and he also served as a legislator in the New Hampshire House of Representatives. Jason, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we're all still trying to digest the results of the election last week. There's a lot of new information we're getting every minute. I recorded the first part of this podcast on Friday, and I said to listeners, you in the future listening to this on Monday will know more than I do. And that is definitely true. Most of the networks called the race for Joe Biden. Of course, none of the states have certified that yet. And there's a ton of pending litigation surrounding this entire election. But assuming for the sake of this conversation that we will see a Biden presidency that has many implications for education policy at the federal level. But thankfully, about 90% of education spending and decision-making in this country comes from state and local governments. And Jason, I think you and I would agree that the closer that number gets to 100, the better off families will be. So to start off, what do we know so far about the state of where state and local governments stand after Tuesday's election?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Not much has changed.
Okay.
Only one state legislature has flipped. That's the New Hampshire state legislature, and they moved from Democrat control to Republican control in both chambers. There are some pending recounts. There are still a few races that they haven't finished counting, so that there could possibly be some other changes. But as of now, there are a number of states that they thought would actually switch from Republican control to Democratic control. That has not happened. And in what we're seeing is in most states, the red states have gotten a little redder and the blue states have gotten a little bluer. But there was not really the blue wave that people expected.
Yeah, interesting. So, COVID sort of cast this whole shadow on the entire election. It changed every assumption that I think everyone had going into the 2020 race. So pre-pandemic, how would you describe the state of school choice among the states? Did you think that we were heading in a positive direction, a negative direction? Where do you think that the country was heading towards school choice pre-pandemic? And then we can get a little bit into how coronavirus changed a lot of those things.
I think we were certainly moving in a positive direction. Every single year, put it this way, about a decade ago, there was a bet between Greg Forrester, who at the time was a fellow at the Friedman Foundation for Educational Choice, now the organization I work for, which is named EdChoice, and Jay Matthews of the Washington Post. Matthews had said that he thought the school choice movement had been exhausted. They were not going to, they had picked the low-hanging fruit. They weren't going to be passing any more bills. Greg predicted that that year there would be at least 10 state legislatures that passed a bill. He has won that bet every year since. So there has been a lot of improvement. Now, look, there's still a long, long way to go. Most of the school choice programs around the country are still relatively small. They're limited to students with special needs, or they're limited to very low-income students, or they may have caps of just a few thousand students that can participate. But we're at a point where about 30 states plus Washington, D.C. have some form of private school choice program. And we've even seen some states take that extra step, moving from school choice to educational choice. So states like Arizona, Florida, Mississippi, Tennessee, North Carolina have what are called education savings accounts, where unlike a traditional voucher where you get a coupon that's worth, let's say, $5,000 and you redeem that at a private school of choice, the ESA is a private restricted use bank account that you can use for private school tuition, but also things like tutoring, textbooks, homeschool curricula, online learning. And so what we've seen is more and more states are looking at ESAs and are expanding the programs that they currently have.
That's great. That's great. So turning to, I mean, that's where we sort of were pre-pandemic. Turning to, coronavirus, the lockdown, school closures. I mean, my sense is that there's been a lot of families who school choice wasn't really something that affected their daily lives. They're pretty happy with their school, to now really understanding the freedom that's at stake when you can't have a say in where you're sending your children to school. Do you share that sentiment? And do you think that COVID has had sort of an interesting impact on how families look at school choice options?
Yes, absolutely. One of the silver linings of this terrible virus is that it has shaken families out of just automatically going with their assigned school, and they've started to think more deeply about and more imaginatively about education arrangements. A lot of parents have been very frustrated with their schools, constantly changing plans, the lack of communication, remaining closed when they think they should be open, or opening but having, either, it depends on the parents you ask. Some will say that, they're insufficiently addressing the virus concerns. Some say that they're overreacting and, squeezing the joy out of education. And so parents have been thinking about new and different arrangements for their children. A recent EdChoice survey showed that more than half of families were either participating in learning pods or were considering doing so. Most of the people that are doing learning pods are just, they're working with their local public school, and they are using the public schools, curriculum online, but their kids are, going to a friend's house to access that. But there are a lot of families that have left the system entirely and are either hiring instructors on their own, or parents are taking turns teaching their children. And a lot of these families are doing this just to get through the pandemic. But what we're hearing is that a lot of families are really happy with the new arrangements, arrangements that they never would have considered before. But now that they're doing it, they find that their kids are happier, they're learning more, they're enjoying school more, they're more excited to wake up in the morning and start learning. So I think that this is going to have long-lasting effects after the pandemic is over.
Interesting. And do you see that this manifested itself in, you said that, not much has changed in these legislatures, but, red states got a little redder, blue states got a little bluer. Do you see the reactions that parents are having sort of play out in how we've seen the way that these state legislatures have gone?
Well, it's too soon to tell.
Yeah.
The legislatures basically, first of all, once the pandemic hit, most legislatures this past year closed down. At least initially. And then by the time they opened back up, they were already getting into election season. And so a lot of them said, look, we're just going to drop everything, and we are only going to focus on, COVID related bills. Mm-hmm. And that's it. So they really haven't had the opportunity to address education in the era of COVID. Mm-hmm. What I do expect is with so many parents expressing frustration about the options that were available to them, parents tended to give a pass to schools when the virus first hit, but they expected that schools would get their act together over the summer. And to the extent that a lot of schools just haven't, at least public schools, the parents are extremely frustrated in the fall, and it looks like this could continue through the spring semester. So if that's the case, I expect that there's going to be a lot of pressure from parents on legislators to have some sort of solution. And one obvious solution is educational choice, is putting the power into the hands of the families to make these decisions and have the money follow the child.
Yeah, I think that there was, to your point, a lot of goodwill and understanding when schools first shut down. Parents said, this is crazy. We understand that we don't really know too much about this virus yet. We want to be safe. We want our families to be safe. We understand a shutdown having for a small period of time, but with this constant back and forth of districts saying they're going to reopen and then them pushing back those dates and then this doing a hybrid option and relying too much on Zoom, I think that goodwill has definitely been exhausted
And I think
for
one thing that
parents.
eroded the goodwill so much is the number of school districts around the country that said, "Oh, we can't open. It's too dangerous."
Hmm.
But if you want daycare, you can send your kids to the school building. We will provide daycare for your kids. We just won't teach them. And to the extent we teach them, they can sit on a laptop in one room and they can be communicating with a teacher that's down the hall, but you have to pay a few $100s, a week or a few $100s a month for this privilege. Uh, it's really unbelievable. And so a lot of
Yeah.
parents started to say, well, you're telling me this is about safety, but I'm still putting my kids in the same building. And now you're charging me for a service that's supposed to be provided for free, just, less of it. So I think that has eroded a lot of goodwill that parents otherwise had toward their local school districts.
Absolutely. I think when the history books write about this time, the time of coronavirus, I think that it will largely be remembered for a lot of the hypocrisy and inconsistency through which this fear of COVID was applied to our different institutions. Schools being one, churches definitely being another one. So what's next for parents who might have a legislature that's friendly to school choice, but really want to get their state going? Want to go, okay, this is the time we have the momentum behind us. We want our state to pass more rigorous school choice options. And you said about 30 states in DC have school choice programs. That's fantastic. But you also mentioned that a lot of them are limited in terms of the students who can participate in them. So what can parents do to really start to get their state to be more proactive in terms of pursuing school choice options?
Well, they should start by reaching out to whatever the local school choice group is in their state. Most states have some sort of group like EdChoice Kentucky, no relation to our organization, but a similar name. School Choice Ohio. In some states like Florida, for example, it would be Step Up for Students, which is the large scholarship organization there. They could also reach out to the State Policy Network affiliate. So organizations like the Goldwater Institute in Arizona or the Rough Rider Institute in North Dakota. These are organizations around the country that are working to advance educational choice, and they can put you in touch with the different organizations that are organizing the grassroots to advance educational choice. And just even beyond that, reach out to your local legislator and ask them, if there is a school choice bill in your state, and that encourage them to support it. These are the sorts of things that they could be doing. Legislators at the state level, they don't often hear from constituents, and when they do, they listen. So it's very important that you reach out to your local legislator and let them know what you think.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the inevitable question after discussing, possible ways for school choice to expand within the states is, what pushback would teachers unions give? And you and I both know that the first thing that happens when states pass this school choice program is that the teachers unions get involved and they try to prevent it. So do you see teachers unions having some momentum and wanting to push back against these school choice programs? I would also love for you to touch for a bit on the role that teachers unions have played in a lot of these school shutdowns that we've seen.
I mean, yeah, absolutely. Anytime there is a bill that shifts the locus of control away from the public ed establishment and toward families, the unions, but also it's not just the unions. It's also the Superintendents Association, and it's a variety of organizations that are invested in the status quo of the public education establishment that push back against it. Teachers unions, though, are probably the most organized and powerful of these different organizations, and so they do take the lead. And we've seen even things like it was the Wall Street Journal reported recently that the NEA, the National Education Association, had put together opposition research documents about a micro school chain in Arizona called Prenda that in just 2.5 years had grown from one micro school with 7 students to nearly 400 micro schools with nearly 4,000 students. And they were doing opposition research on this chain because they were upset that parents were leaving their traditional district schools and finding new ways of educating their children. So I do expect that in the coming years, like you mentioned, the teachers unions drove pretty much these shutdowns across the country. There was some research, I believe, from Corey DeAngelis at the Reason Foundation, and some others. I think there was another one from Brookings, showing that areas where the teachers unions had more power, they were more likely to face shutdowns, regardless of whether there was an outbreak in that area or not. So if the schools remain shut down and parents are looking for alternatives, the unions are going to do everything in their power, I think, to prevent families from finding those alternatives.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's hope that the coming years we will see some decreased power from the teachers unions, and more parents. The more parents get involved, I think that the more we can see some pushback on this and the ability to influence their states to pursue more school choice options. Jason, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
My pleasure. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you for joining us on COVID and the Classroom. I look forward to bringing you more essential information for parents, educators, and students during this critical time. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app to receive a new episode every other Monday. If you enjoyed the show, please be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts and share the show with someone who might enjoy it. We hope to see you next time.
COVID and the Classroom is brought to you by more than 500,000 members of the Heritage Foundation. Sound design by Lauren Evans, Mark Guiney, and John Popp.